Okay, good, amen. Well, it's time to continue now with Abraham.
所以我们要再次继续亚伯拉罕。
And you might remember that last time we took just a little break to look at the overall geography, the land of Israel.
还记不记得上次有点中断，就是要来介绍整个以色列的那个地理。
But now that we kind of have a feeling for what the land is like, we're going to go with Abraham into the land.
那我们知道整个以色列的地形之后，现在我们要跟着亚伯拉罕进入这一块地了。
And the first place that Abraham came to in the land of Canaan, according to the Bible, was Shechem.
照着圣经所讲的，亚伯拉罕第一个进去的就是示剑。
And this gives us an idea of how probably Abraham came, probably down this road here, the King's Highway, and then cutting over to Shechem.
所以，假如这样子来猜测，应该他是从上方那边沿着王之道，然后一直往下走到示剑城。
Which, by the way, is the same way that Jacob later came back into the land after he had gone to the north.
就是雅各去北方之后，要回来南部，也是走这一条路线。
So this would take him down this little valley here, wadi here, if you can see it, and then across the Jordan River.
这边会走到一些那个山谷，然后要跨过那约旦河。
And if we actually go there, this is what it looks like.
若是从这边来看，就是长这样。
This is the Jordan Valley.
这个就是约旦河谷。
And then these are the mountains on the Israel side.
那就是那边的以色列那边的山。
And then from there he goes up into another wadi here on the other side.
从这边又往那边去，进到另外一个山谷。
Which goes right up into the hill country of Israel.
就是经过那个在山丘上的那个的城耶路撒冷城，进到那边去。
And from there you just kind of turn south.
然后从那边再往那个南边走。
And this takes you up until you finally arrive at Shechem, right up there.
那接着往上行的话，就是走到最那个箭头那里的示剑城。
Now, when Abraham came to Shechem, there was no city there yet at that time.
当亚伯兰到达那时候，这边还没有城。
You can just barely see some of the rocks of the ancient city down here at the bottom.
在这个图片的下方，你可以看到古城的一些遗迹。
And of course, these are all modern houses in here.
现在你看到的这些城市，那个房子都是现代的。
And then you can see this is Mount Gerizim going up above.
然后这边就是那个往上的那个山。
But there was a city here later in the time of Jacob, so that lets us know about when the city was first built.
那之后呢，雅各也来到这边，所以知道说在那时候这个城也已经盖好了。
But when Abraham was there, the Bible only mentions a site or a place, makom in Hebrew.
在希伯来文说 makom， 是亚伯兰经过那地的时候，只是像一个区域而已。
And here there was a large tree called an elon in Hebrew.
在那边有一个很大的树，在希伯来文叫做 elon。
Now a lot of Bible translations translate this as oak, but probably it's what we call a terebinth tree.
圣经翻译的是橡树，但是这事实上呢，应该是这个我不会念，独立黄连木。
This is a big hardwood tree that has lots of shade.
那这种树是很大的，然后很多的枝干。
So of course it's going to be a very comfortable place to stop in the heat of the Middle East.
所以特别在中东那么炎热的地方，要停在这种树下是比较舒服的。
And here God appeared to Abraham.
在这边，神对亚伯拉罕显现，
And he gave him another promise.
给他另外一个应许了。
As it says, and the Lord revealed himself to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land.
他说：“耶和华向亚伯兰显现说，我要把这块地赐给你的后裔，后裔的原文是种子。”
So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him.
所以他在神对他显现的地方又盖了一个坛。
Now you would think that the promises Abraham already received were enough, right?
你觉得亚伯拉罕应该领受足够应许的话语了啦？
Remember, before he even left to come to the promised land, God had promised to make him a great nation.
还记不记得他要离开他的本家，要应许地？神已经应许说要给他到应许的地方。
He had promised that he would be blessed,
也应许他要蒙福，
that he would be famous and would be a blessing to all the nations.
他也要很有名，成为列国的祝福。
These are amazing promises.
这些都是很奇妙的应许。
But here at Shechem, God gave him another promise.
但是在这边，神又给他另外一个应许，
That he would give the land, the whole land, the land of Canaan, which today we call Israel, to Abraham's
他
descendants.
说要把那个整个迦南地，就是我们称为以色列的，给他的后裔。
Now this promise is right in today's headlines.
那这个应许一直到现在了。
Whose land should the land of Israel be?
所以谁该是在以色列这块地的主人呢？
Should it belong to the Jews? Should it belong to the Arabs?
这到底应该属于犹太人还是阿拉伯人呢？
One time in the UN Security Council,
有一次呢，联合国安理会，
the Israeli representative held up his Bible.
有人就拿起了圣经，
He said, "The land is ours, and here I have the deed of ownership."
who's doing that？
This is the Israeli representative to
那
the
就是那
UN.
个以色列代表就举起圣经说，这块地是我们的，是照着圣经里面所记载的应许。
You know, Abraham must have been overwhelmed by the promises that God was giving him.
那亚伯拉罕应该因着神给他这么大的应许，好像整个都被淹没了一样。
I don't think he ever even imagined promises like these.
我不相信他曾经可以想象出像这样的应许来。
But isn't God the same with us?
那神对我们是不是也是这样呢？
When we're called by God, He gives us the most amazing promises.
当我们被神呼召的时候，他给我们很奇妙的应许，
The promise of eternal life.
那是永恒的生命的应许。
The promise that we will reign with King Messiah.
应许说我们要跟弥赛亚一起来掌权。
The promise of a new Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth.
应许我们有新的耶路撒冷，有新天新地。
These are greater promises than we could even ever imagine on our own.
这些都是很大的应许，是我们自己想象不出来的。
So what did Abraham do in response to this amazing new promise?
所以亚伯拉罕如果回应这么大的应许呢，
He built an altar to worship God.
他就筑了一座坛来敬拜神。
Now altars were an important part of desert religion.
那在那个旷野的那些宗教里面，那个祭坛呢是很重要的一个部分。
They were used for animal sacrifice.
他们会献上动物的祭。
Now don't confuse the altars of the Bible with the altars that you see in many churches today.
所以不要误会了，我们在今日教会看到的那个讲坛、祭坛不是当下的那种样子。
These altars in churches are just tables.
然后在教会的那个祭坛只是像桌子一样。
But the altars of the Old Testament were large square structures made of dirt or stone.
那在旧约里面的这些祭坛，要不就是用土筑成，要不就是用岩石筑成的。
This is an actual altar from the time of Abraham.
下面看到的就是亚伯拉罕时期的那个祭坛。
And you can see how big it is. This is one corner, another corner, and there's my hat. So it's quite large.
那个就是老师的帽子，这个角落到那个角落到那个角落，就差不多是这么大。
And they would come up at, about waist high.
它差不多到人的腰间。
The dimensions of later altars in the Bible
在圣经后来所描述的祭坛，
say that they were 2.5 meters square.
就是2.5 meter， 2米半，
And about 1.5 meters high.
然后是2米高，1米半高，然后2米的四方形。
And then on top of the altar, they would pile up branches and wood and make a fire.
然后在坛上面，他们就用那些树枝，然后来燃火。
Then they would slaughter the animal.
他们在那边就杀了祭物，
They remove the skin,
把皮剥下，
probably cut up the pieces,
也许有些是用切块，
or at least that's the way they did it in later times.
就是有些就照着他们那时候要求的做，
And then they put the pieces up on the fire.
把这些肉块都放到火里烧。
And they burned it until it was completely burned up.
他们就开始烧这些肉块，直到完全烧尽。
So this burning of the animal is called in Hebrew an olah, which means a going up.
所以这样的烧祭呢，在希伯来叫 olah， 就是 going up 上升。
Or sometimes it's translated kind of in an explanatory way. It's a whole burnt offering. The whole thing is burnt up completely.
这种也解释，只要圣经解释就是全烧祭，就是燔祭。
And the symbolism is that the smoke goes up to God in heaven, goes up to the Creator, Sky God, as we
所以
talked about
这
it.
样的记号就是那烟幕就往上，烧的烟就往上，一直到空中，到那个神那里。
Now, this is completely different than the offerings that were given to the idol gods in Mesopotamia.
在米索不达米亚，他们的偶像崇拜的那个献祭方式完全不一样。
There, they prepared several course meals for their idols, meals that were prepared just like in a restaurant.
那他们献祭的是要准备像一道餐一样的，然后要献祭给偶像，就是正式的餐。
And then these meals were secretly eaten by the priests after the worshippers had gone.
在拜过这些神祇偶像之后呢，这些祭司就偷偷的把这些祭物都吃掉。
In Mesopotamia, they had no burnt sacrifice.
在米索不达米亚并没有像神讲的这种燔祭，
They only killed the animals in order to prepare the meals.
他们只杀动物是要预备那些餐。
The closest thing to a sacrifice that they had is when they would kill an animal to inspect its organs, looking for signs from the gods.
他们要杀那些动物来献祭，其实是要打开他们身体来看，来阅读那个动物的内脏，可以读出什么东西。
So this was a completely different worship system than that found in the Bible.
所以这跟圣经里面的敬拜呢，是完全不一样的方式。
The Mesopotamian gods originated as city gods. They were the god of one city originally.
所以米索不达米亚的偶像都是那个城市之神，就是一个城市就一个神。
And so they only had power in that one area originally.
他们的神呢，的能力只在那个城市里面。
But the ascending smoke from the altars of the desert is a beautiful symbol that God, the true God, is not limited to any one place on earth.
而在旷野这样的献祭烧祭，让香往上升，这是很美的一个记号，代表这位神是无所不在的神。
But that He's above the earth, that He's in heaven.
他是超越这一切之上，在天上的神，
He's completely different than we are.
是跟我们完全不一样的一位神。
And unlike the idols of Mesopotamia, He is not under our control.
所以跟那米索不达米亚所拜的那些偶像完全不一样，就是这位神不受人的掌控。
Now, the earliest clear mention of these burnt offerings in the Bible is by Noah.
在圣经里面记载很清楚的这个燔祭，就是在挪亚那边有记载。
After the flood, he built an altar and he sacrificed burnt offerings to God.
就是在那个洪水之后，他就献上燔祭给神。
As it says there in Genesis 8, verse 20.
在创世纪第八章20节。
Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and made them go up. There it is, going up as a whole burnt offering on the altar.
挪亚为耶和华筑了一座坛，拿各类洁净的牲畜、飞鸟献在坛上为燔祭，让那香往上升。
Job, who lived in the general same time as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob,
约伯是他的年代是跟那个亚伯拉罕他们同样的那个年代，
he also offered up burnt offerings to God.
他也对神献上这燔祭。
Even though, as far as we know, he never met Abraham or Isaac or Jacob.
当然，我们知道在圣经里面看见约伯都没有跟亚伯拉罕、以撒、雅各他们有碰面过。
It says in Job chapter 1, verse 5.
在第1章的第5节，他说
Job rose early in the morning and offered burnt offerings.
约伯清晨起来，按着他们众人的数目献燔祭。
You know, even the Chinese people preserve the memory that their earliest ancestors worshiped the God of heaven, Shangdi, with animal sacrifices.
甚至在华人的记忆里面，在早期，他们那个华人的献祭也是在那个这对着天上的上帝来献祭，烧燔祭。
This was a form of worship that continued until the 20th century by the Emperor of China.
这事实上一直到20世纪那个之前的那个皇帝国度之前都是用这种天坛的祭拜上帝。
Now, Abraham did not stay long at Shechem.
那亚伯拉罕在世间并没有待太久。
The next place he came to was Bethel,
他下一个去的地方就是伯特利。
or actually the hill between Bethel and Ai.
事实上呢，是伯特利跟爱之间的那个山丘。
As it says, then he proceeded from there to the mountain to the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built another altar.
那从那里，他又迁到伯特利东边的山，支搭帐篷，庆 边是伯特利，东边是爱。他在那里又为耶和华筑了一座坛，求告耶和华的名。
Now this is a view of the place that we're talking about.
这个就是我们看见的那个山丘。
Here in the foreground is where Bethel was.
在平地这边是伯特利。
And then this is the hill between Bethel on this side and Ai on the other side.
那这个山丘的另外一边就是爱，所以是在伯特利跟爱之间的这个山丘上。
So somewhere here, Abraham set up his tent and he built another altar to the Lord.
所以在这个山丘的某个地方，他就在那边建了坛，献上燔祭了。
Now Ai, which you can probably see from his tent, was already a ruin at that time.
在爱城，也许可以看到有一些那个废墟，就从那个时代来的一些废墟。
In fact, that's what Ai means. It means the ruin.
那爱这个字的意思就是那个废墟的意思。
This was one of the cities abandoned during the very unstable time in which Abraham lived.
就是在亚伯拉罕那时代，动荡不安的时刻，那个爱城是被放弃的一座城。
Then from Bethel and Ai, he continued on down through the hill country to the dry and barren desert in the south near the city of Beersheba.
接着他从这个地方，就是伯特利跟爱的中间，一直往下走，经过很干的这个旷野，进到拔示巴。
Now, as a shepherd, Abraham always had to be on the move to find enough pasture for his flocks.
身为牧羊人，亚伯拉罕就必须到处去迁移，去找那些草给他的那些动物吃。
At the edge of the desert, there's only a little grass growing here and there between the rocks.
在这岩石当中，只有这边少数的草，那边少数的草。
For the sheep to get enough to eat, the shepherd has to keep them moving all day long.
所以，因着要让羊吃足够的草，那牧羊人必须整天都不断的移动。
Then once they've grazed over an area for a few days, they need to move on to another area.
这边的草足够吃几天之后，他们就必须要再挪到别的地方去了。
And in the Bible, this is called literally a pulling up stakes or pulling up the tent pegs. You know, you have to pull up those pegs to take down the tent so that you can go on to the next place.
是在圣经里面的描述，就是你要拔出那个桩脚，要把那个帐篷卷一卷了，然后挪到下一个地方去的意思。
I think the Chinese is gradually, right?
Yeah.
But the actual Hebrew is pulling up.
那中文在和合本圣经说它渐渐的移到，但事实上在原文里面不是说它渐渐移，而是他说它不断的要拔出桩，不断的要拔出桩脚。
Well, why didn't Abraham go to a more well-watered area down in the valleys or near the coast?
那为什么亚伯拉罕不去到那个水比较多的，就像山谷底下或者是海边呢？
Well, if you remember, those other areas were the area of the farmer.
记不记得？其实另外那些地方都是农夫们住的地方。
These were places that Canaanites were living in, farming the land.
那是迦南人所住的地方，是属于农耕的地方。
They would not be very happy with a shepherd bringing his herds in to eat their crops.
若是牧羊人把羊群带到那边喝水的话，他们那些人是不高兴的。
But up in the hill country was the area of the shepherd.
那在山丘上的那些地方，才是牧羊人所动的地方。
And the Bible indicates that there were not many people living up there at the time.
然后在圣经里面也提到，在那段时间，山丘上是不太有人居住的。
So Abraham could easily move his flocks wherever he wanted to.
所以亚伯拉罕可以很容易的到处带着他的羊群游走去吃草。
The tents they used were probably not much different than those used by Bedouins still today.
那这些帐篷跟今日的帐篷并没有太大差别，
A long rectangular tent
是比较长形的这种帐篷，
divided into sections by curtains.
用那个布帘分隔成几块几个区域。
Now, living in a tent does not mean that you are poor.
那住在帐篷里面不代表你就是贫穷的。
The Bible tells us that Abraham was rich.
那因为圣经告诉我们，亚伯拉罕很有钱。
And in ancient times, the wealth of the desert was legendary.
那所以在那个在古时候，在旷野的像这些游牧民族是非常那个富足的。
Individual herdsmen could have flocks numbering in the hundreds, numbering in the thousands.
他们个别各自都可以拥有几百只的那些羊群、牛群，甚至到千。
Today you can see tents with TV antennas sticking out.
那今天我们看见的这些，就是那个电视上看的这个帐篷是这样。
And with cars and tractors parked outside.
那他们的货车或者是汽车都停在帐篷外面。
Even an 18-wheeler.
甚 18 wheeler
Big truck, you know.
甚至是18个轮子的那个大货车。
One of my professors knew a computer expert who spoke several languages living in a tent.
所以像有一些那些像我的教授还有一些学者专家们，他们其实也都是住在那个帐篷里。
Why did he live in the tent? He didn't have to do that.
为什么他要住在帐篷里呢？他其实不需要这么住啊。
He liked it.
但是他喜欢住在帐篷里。
There are Arab university professors who live in tents in Israel today.
今日还有那些阿拉伯的那些学者们，他们仍然是住在那个帐篷里。
It's their culture. It's their heritage.
那是他们的文化，是他们的遗产。
Near Jerusalem, you can see Bedouin tents and modern apartment buildings right next to each other.
所以在新耶路撒冷城这边，你会看到有帐篷，也有那些房子的建筑，有帐篷，也有房子的建筑参差。
And some people, even though they live in a modern home, they still have a tent outside near the home.
甚至现在现代的人，他们有自己的房屋了，但是旁边他们还是有盖自己的帐篷。
So living in a tent does not mean that you are backward or uncivilized.
所以住在帐篷不代表你是后退了，是不文明的。
The desert life of the Bedouin has a long and a noble history.
那在贝都因人，他们住在帐篷里面是一个很长的，而且是很尊贵的一个历史。
They are very skilled survivors in an incredibly challenging and difficult environment.
他们充满了各式各样的技巧，来可以让自己可以生存。
Even their customs are carefully refined survival skills that have been developed over thousands of years of time.
甚至几千年以来，他们也是不断的发展新的技术技巧，让自己可以这么存活在那个旷野里。
Their tents today, as in the time of Abraham, are made of black or dark brown goat hair.
他们的帐篷跟亚伯拉罕时代的帐篷是一样，是用那个黑山羊的毛来筑成的。
Why this dark color?
为什么要用这种暗色的毛呢？
Because black protects against the ultraviolet radiation of the sun.
因为这个黑色的深色的毛织成的，可以避开太阳的紫外线。
Because you see there in the desert, it's not only the heat of the sun that's dangerous.
所以在旷野中，不只是太阳的热气是很危险。
There's also the UV rays, the ultraviolet rays that can cause you to pass out.
甚至太阳下来的那个紫外线也会让人倒闭昏迷的。
This is why the Bedouin women, you see them a lot of times wearing black.
这是为什么？你看贝都因的妇女，大部分时间看到她们都是穿黑色的。
It's actually been proven that under black, it's just a little bit cooler than for other colors.
事实上也证明了，科学证明了，在那个黑色的那个布的下面，是比外面还要稍微再冷一点，凉一点的。
So goat hair is really an excellent material for these tents.
所以这样的黑山羊的毛，就是要织这帐篷最完美的材料了。
When the tent gets wet, the hairs absorb water and they expand, and that makes the tent almost watertight.
当他们接收到雨水的时候，那个羊毛就会那个好像承重拉开来，然后会把那个水储存在那个毛里面。
But in summertime, the fibers dry and that leaves more air between them so the air can circulate.
那夏季的时候是很干旱的，然后那个羊毛就会更多的缝隙就会跑出来，让它们很多空气可以吹得进毛跟毛之间的那些缝隙。
Now, of course, you need to tie the tent down very tightly so it doesn't blow away.
所以他们必须把这个帐篷架得很紧，免得被风吹走。
And so they will usually set up the tents in a little spot that's protected from the wind, which is the dangerous wind is usually the one coming from the west.
所以这个比较危险的风是从那个西边这边过来的，所以他们必须要有点屏障的地方来盖这个帐篷，来搭这个帐篷。
And they will set them up so they're facing east so that they can catch the early morning rays of the sun.
那他们要搭帐篷都是面对到东边，意思就是说，当太阳上升的时候，他们可以看得到的阳光。
And so when the weather is good, usually they leave the east side completely open.
所以甚至天气好的时候，他们的那个东边这边的，就甚至整个打开来受阳光。
Now when the sun shines through the black tent cloth, you see hundreds of little white dots of light above you.
当太阳它照射透过这个帐篷的时候，植物的时候，你会看见就是很多像那样点点的那个光线呈现在那里。
It looks like the stars in the night sky.
这看起来就很像夜间的那星空。
And this is the source of imagery in the Bible, like in Psalm 19.
就像诗篇119篇所写的，变成是他们写诗的一个题材了。
It says the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and then He's placed a tent for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of its chamber is rising from one of the heavens to the other.
所以他说，诸天述说神的荣耀，他的亮带通遍天下，他的言语传到地极。神在其间为太阳安设帐幕，就是这个帐篷。
So you see, for them, that tent and the experience of living inside the tent is a picture of the heavens.
所以你看，他们住在这帐篷里面，对他们来讲，好像是看着那个天空，是住在天上的感觉了。
Also in Isaiah 40, verse 22.
是以赛亚书4章22节写。
Speaking of God, says He who sits above the vault of the earth and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in.
这边描述神说他坐在地球大圈上，地上的居民好像蝗虫，他铺张穹苍如幔子，展开诸天如可住的帐篷，也是用这种帐篷来形容。
Also in Psalm 104.
诗篇104篇。
Lord my God, you're very great. You've clothed yourself in splendor and majesty, wrapping yourself with light as a cloak, stretching the heavens like a tent cloth.
耶和华我的神啊，你为至大，你以尊荣威严为衣服，披上亮光如披外袍，铺张穹苍如铺幔子，就是这个像那个布，羊毛布一样。
Now this idea of heaven is like a tent above us.
所以这个想法说，天国就像一个天，就像一个布幕遮蔽着我们。
In some places led to the view that, the stars are just kind of holes in the tent, shining the light of God from the other side.
所以在帐篷的上面好像有星星，就是因为那太阳这样照射下来之后，一点一点的，对他们来讲就像繁星一样。
The tabernacle in the Bible in the time of Moses,
在摩西时代的会幕，
it's just a very fancy one of these goat hair tents.
是这些同样的帐篷的稍微豪华一点，
Built as a home or a house for God.
是为神造了他的家，他的房子。
But unlike the stone temples of the idols, it moved with the people. They carried it with them.
不像那些石雕的那些偶像一样，这些神的会幕是跟着百姓一起在移动的。
What is the meaning?
那什么意思呢？
That God is with us. He moves with us, not like the unmovable temples of the idols.
所以不是像那些偶像的庙宇这样都不动的，而是代表说神跟着他的百姓一直在移动，是神跟百姓在一起的。
And of course, this is a picture pointing to Jesus,
当然，这个画面就指向了耶稣了。
who John tells us literally tabernacled among us.
还有就是约翰福音约翰所讲的，就是他就像那个帐篷道成肉身的帐篷与我们在一起，
Living like in a camp. He camped with us.
他是跟我们住在这个棚子里面，跟我们住在一
God
起。
with us.
神与我们同住。
And this sponsored such beautiful poetry as Psalm 61 verse 4.
这在诗篇61篇也写出很美的一条诗。
Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of your wings.
我要永远住在你的帐篷里，我要投靠在你翅膀下的隐秘处。
Tents are often a symbol of the temporary nature of life.
那在帐篷代表的就是非常自然的那个生命的短暂。
In 2 Corinthians 5, for we know that if our earthly house of the tent, that is our body, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, which is eternal in the heavens.
哥林多后书5章1节，我们原知道我们在这地上的帐篷就是我们自己，若拆毁了，必得神所造，不是人手所造，在天上永存的房屋。
So therefore, pulling up the stakes, the tent pegs, remember that, is also a symbol of death.
所以，若是那个帐篷拔桩了，就代表了这个生命的死亡了。
As it says in Job 4, without anyone noticing, they perish forever. Is not their tent cord pulled up within them?
在约伯记4章20节到21节，早晚之间就被毁灭，永归无有，无人理会。他帐篷的绳索就是那个桩，岂不从中抽出来吗？就是拔桩了。
Now, you know somebody in the Bible who made tents like these.
我们也知道圣经里面有人是盖这种布幕帐幕的，
The Apostle Paul.
就是使徒保罗。
Acts 18:3 says, because he, this Paul, was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers.
在使徒行传18章第3节，他跟那个亚基拉、百基拉他们本是制造帐篷为业的，跟他们一样。保罗因为与他们同业，就跟他们同住做工。
Now, in the time of the Bible, there were one or more tents for each family.
所以在圣经里面，他讲在一个家庭里面会超过一个以上的帐篷。
If a man had many wives, he would have many tents, one tent for each wife.
所以，假如一个人有好几个太太，他就有好几个帐篷，一个帐篷给一个太太。
So a wedding meant adding another tent.
那要结婚的时候，那个男人儿子要结婚的时候，就盖另外一个帐篷。
And this is still remembered in traditional Jewish weddings today.
这也成为是现在到今日犹太人的那种婚礼的习俗。
During the ceremony, the bride and the groom stand together under a bridal canopy called in Hebrew a chuppah.
就是那个他们犹太人的婚礼都会在都会架一个棚子，然后在棚子底下就是呼把，在它下面。
Which is symbolically a tent that they are under.
这个就是代表说他们是在那个帐篷，他们自己的帐篷底下。
And that's because in the old days, the couple that was getting married would go to an actual tent privately while the wedding feast was going on.
所以在传统里面，当一对新人要结婚的时候，他们要盖另外一个帐幕，然后呢庆典就在那个新的帐幕里面，帐篷里面在庆祝。
And when they spent this time alone privately with nobody else, that's when they were considered married.
所以当这样庆典完了，大家都走了，都没人的时候，他们私下在一起相处，就是他们的婚礼完成。
Now, this symbolism of the wedding tent also appears in prophecy.
在那个预言里面也出现有关乎这个天棚，就帐篷。
In speaking of the wedding feast of the Lamb when Jesus returns.
讲到说耶稣再临的时候，那羔羊的婚宴。
In Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5.
在以赛亚书第4章第5节。
The Lord will also create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and smoke and the brightness of a flame of fire by night. For over all the glory will be a chuppah, a canopy.
他说，耶和华也必在喜安全山，并各会众以上，使白日有烟雾，黑夜有火焰的火光。因为在全荣耀之上，必有这个遮蔽，遮蔽就是这个chuppah，就是上面这个棚子。我们中文有时候会翻成天棚啊，
So this is a symbol of the time when the Bible teaches us that the church will be like the bride of Christ and will be presented to Him.
这个就是在教会里面讲的记号，就是我们就是基督的心腹这样子的婚礼，像这样子的。
Now, in the early 20th century, Western explorers found each Bedouin family living in tents divided into sections, as they still do today.
他们在20世纪初，那些专家们他们有发现那些棚子，他们用那个帐篷用棚子来区隔出来，到现在他们仍然是用这种区隔方式。
There was the women's quarters on one side, the men's quarters on the other
那
side.
这边是女人的院，然后那边是男人的院。
And the men's quarter had a carpet on the ground,
那在男人院那边，在地上有那个毯子，
was very clean and orderly,
是很干净而且很有秩序。
had some nice decorative objects around.
在上面旁边都有这些摆设物品。
And the women's quarter,
那女人的这个院呢？
there was everything else.
在女人的这一边呢，什么都有。
Well, why is there a big difference between the men's and women's quarters?
为什么他们区隔出来男生跟女生的那个部分，这么大的不一样呢？
Because one of the jobs of the man was to receive guests and visitors, which they would entertain with bitter coffee and sweet tea.
因为在男人的那一部分的那个帐篷，他们必须在那边接待那个朋友宾客，然后再供应给他们好的咖啡或茶。
You can always tell when there's a visitor to a Bedouin tent.
那你会你常常会看到有宾客来拜访他们的帐篷。
Because you will soon hear the tunk, 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 tunk of the coffee grinder, right?
为什么你会知道常常有宾客呢？因为他们就开始磨，那磨那些咖啡粉或什么，就会有那些声音出来。刚刚老师示范的那个
I
声
mean,
音。
they actually play it almost like a musical instrument, right?
他们在磨那些，就很像在弹奏一个乐器的，有那个高低音。
And this is an invitation for anybody in the area to come and have a cup of coffee.
那这个地方是邀请大家都可以来这边喝一杯咖啡的。
When the host offers his guest a cup of coffee, at first the guest refuses.
当开始主人要供应给咖啡给客人咖啡的时候，客人会先拒绝，
But the host encourages him,
那主人就会一直邀请他。
and soon they're drinking coffee together and talking merrily away.
最后呢，他们就一起喝咖啡，然后一起谈论事情。
Now, of course, it's true that coffee did not become part of the Bedouin lifestyle until the Middle Ages.
到那个Middle Ages 到中世纪那时候，这样子都还是维持像这个样子。
But we see a similar kind of desert hospitality in Genesis 18, in the time of Abraham.
在亚伯拉罕的那个就是创世纪18章那边，我们看见他们在接待客人的方式又有点不一样了。
Do you remember when he encouraged his 3 heavenly visitors to stop and have a meal with him?
还记不记得他邀请那3个？他说3个使者造访他的时候，他邀请他们来用餐。
Now, when men come to visit,
当男人来拜访，
the women are never seen by the visitors.
那女人是不会去跟那个拜访者见面。
They remain behind the curtain in the women's quarters.
他们必须是在那个棚子的后方，就是属于女人的部分。
Just as Sarah remained in the tent.
这个就像莎拉，她会躲在那个棚子旁边，在偷听。
Why did the women remain hidden away like this?
为什么女人必须要把自己躲藏在那布幕后面呢？
It was done for survival.
因为这是为了生存。
The tents are very, very far away from each other.
那每一个帐篷都离得很远。
And if a man came along and he liked your wife, he could kill you and take her, right? Nobody would stop him.
所以，若是有男人来拜访你了，他看到你的太太，他想要的话，就会把你杀了，把你的太太带走，但没有人会知道。
So the wives were always hidden away.
所以这是为什么，太太们都要坐在另外一边，躲在棚子的另外一边。
Even today, if you visit a traditional Arab home, you will never see the wife. She's back in the kitchen behind a screen.
所以到今日的那个阿拉伯人，你去拜访他们，也不会看到他们太太，太太都是在棚子的后方。
Now, this high value on hospitality in the desert is not just for fun.
在旷野这样子的那个对接待宾客这么高层次的接待方式，不是为了有趣。
Life in the desert depends on receiving guests and visitors. They are vital links to the outside world.
那在他们的外在的世界里面，在帐篷里面可以接待这些宾客，还有那拜访者，是一个很大的一个他们生活的情况。
They bring information on which the life or death of the family can depend.
那这也关乎到他们整个家庭生或死的情况了。
You know, in the old days, this was the only way to get information about what's going on in the desert,
因
even
为
today
在
sometimes.
古时候，在旷野能够得到任何资讯消息的，只有靠这样外来的人把这消息带过来给他们。
And you needed information about water, about grazing, where is there still grass, where are the other tribes moving.
所以你必须要有足够的资讯，知道哪边有水，哪边有草，然后外界哪些地方正在移动。
What's the price going for sheep and goats in the market this week?
那这个礼拜在市场那个羊的价格如何？牛羊的价格如何呢？
And all this different information had to be taken into account when the family is planning its next moves. It's like a big chess game in the desert.
所以在他们要把它 们要进到下一个地方的时候，这些资讯都必须他们要参考到这些资讯来决定下一个地方要搭帐篷的地方。
Because of this, any Bedouin traveling through the desert can stop at a tent and receive 3 days of hospitality.
所以任何地方他们在那边搭棚子，你到了任何一个棚子那边，你都可以在那边被接待，有3天可以在他们的棚子里。
Even from his worst enemy.
甚至面对最糟糕的仇敌，仍然可以这么做。
Although after 3 days, you better look out.
但是3天之后，你就要小心看来住的这个人是怎么样。
Now, this cultural value of taking care even of your enemy, because of the much bigger enemy of the desert, is something that we see in the law of Moses.
在那个罗德还有那个Moses， 在摩西的时代，我们就看见像这种接待宾客、接待仇敌的文化，在那时候都还是可以呈现出来。
Remember, it says if you encounter your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you will surely return it to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless, you will not just leave it.
他这边已经讲了，这是为什么你在帐篷里面也会接待到，也必须接待你的仇敌。他说，若遇见你的仇敌的牛或乳驴失迷了路，只要牵回来交给他。若看见恨你的人的驴压卧在众头之下，不可走开，不要与奴主一同排开众服。
And of course, we see the same attitude in the Gospels.
在福音里面，我们看见同样的心态。
Jesus said to love your enemies and pray for them.
耶稣说要爱你的仇敌，为他们祷告。
Now, the Bedouin have to be very careful in moving their herds.
然后在他们迁徙的他们要必须很小心。
Water holes only have so much water.
因为他们水资源是那么有限。
The trees in a desert oasis only have so much fruit.
在旷野中的这样的树，可以有的也是食物也是很少。
The little grass is quickly eaten.
那个小的草很快会被吃光。
And this is the reason that Bedouin needs so much space to move around in.
这是为什么贝都因人需要那么大的一块地不断的迁徙。
Depending on the location, the amount of land required for a single goat may be as much as 100 acres.
Single goat.
Just for one goat. So if you have 10 goats, you need 10 times as much, right?
OK， 若是为了一头羊，你要带它去吃草，是需要这样子的地方。那有可能你有10头羊的话，你要带到更广大的地方去找草吃。
No, it's just not much to eat.
因为能够吃的草不多。
Now, sheep are used as a symbol, as you know, for people over and over again in the Bible.
在圣经里面，我们知道羊不断被描述成为百姓。
And so it's no accident that many of the most important leaders in the Bible were trained for leadership by many years of being a shepherd.
所以这是为什么在圣经里面的领袖，你都看见他们都是经过很多年，也是牧羊人的这种训练而来。
Abraham,
亚伯拉罕、
Isaac,
以撒、
Jacob,
雅各、
Moses,
摩西、
David.
大卫。
Because the purpose of the shepherd is not just to lead the sheep to good grazing.
所以牧羊人的工作不只是带羊进到有草可吃之地，
And keep them moving all day.
也要让那些羊不断的每天都在行进。
It was also to protect them from animals and from thieves.
在这样的过程中，也同时要保护这些羊免于那些野兽的侵袭。
In ancient times, there were many more of these dangerous animals than are found today.
在古时候，那些危险的野兽比现在我们知道的还要多。
There were bears and lions,
有熊，有狮子。
hyenas. There are still hyenas there.
Hyenas 怎么讲？野狗。
And jackals.
还有 jackals。
It's like a wild dog.
野狗就是野狗。猎那个字，猎狗。
Now, the way to protect the sheep at night was to put them into a sheepfold.
那能够保护这些羊群的，就是让他们到那个洞里头。
This was a circular wall of stones
所以用石头筑一个墙，
with a small opening on one side.
只有在一边有一个小小的开口。
And this is where the sheep would go in and out.
那这个羊呢，就从这小小开口进出。
Now, usually you didn't need to build one each time. You could just use the old ones that were in the desert for hundreds and hundreds of years.
你不必每一次都要筑新的，因为在整个旷野里面 面，你都会找到那个甚至存有好几百年的，他们已经煮好的这些，你可以都去使用。
Although sometimes they would put, they'd pull up thorn bushes and put the thorn bushes on top to keep the foxes from jumping in during the night.
有时候他们在这些墙上面会放那些荆棘，那个刺的荆棘，免得那些狼在夜间他会又跳过那个围墙要进来。
And remember, this is what Jesus was talking about in John chapter 10, verse 1.
这就是耶稣在约翰第10章第1节所说的。
He who does not enter by the door into the sheepfold, but climbs up some other way, is a thief and a robber.
人进羊圈不从门进去，从别处爬进去，那人就是贼，就是强盗。
Now, every evening when they put the sheep into the sheepfold, they will count the sheep as they go in. They look at each one to make sure everything's okay.
所以他们让羊进去的时候，他们要数算那些羊只是不是正确，然后每一只羊都没问题。
Then one of the shepherds would actually lie down in the door of the sheepfold.
事实上呢，接着牧羊人其中一个牧羊人会躺在这个入口
To be sure that none of the sheep went out during the night.
就是确认在夜间没有羊会跑出去。
And this is also mentioned by Jesus.
这耶稣也提到这事。
He said, I am the door of the sheep. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture.
他说：“我就是羊的门，就是这个小开口。凡从我进来的，必然得救，并且出入得草吃。”
In other words, he's telling us as the door of the sheep that he's a good shepherd and he's taking care of his flock.
所以事实上，他告诉我们，他是羊的门，就是他是一个好的牧羊人，他守在这个门，让羊可以很安全。
Now, in the morning, it was no problem to separate the sheep, even if more than one flock had come together into the sheepfold that night.
Even one flock.
Yeah, sometimes more than one flock would come together and they would all be in the sheepfold together.
有时候白天呢到处放牧是没问题，那夜间甚至不只是有一群羊会进到这边，别群羊也可以进来这里。
Why was that not a problem?
那这样为什么还有另外的问题呢？
Because the sheep know the voice of their shepherd.
这个就是为什么在同一个羊圈里面有不同群的羊，那自己的羊认得自己牧者的声音，
And they won't follow anybody else.
所以他们这群羊不会去跟随别的牧者。
And this is what Jesus was talking about.
这就是耶稣所谈论的了。
He who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out.
这就是为什么耶稣会讲这句话，因为这个躲藏的这个夜间躲藏地方会不止一群羊，所以他说从门进去的才是羊的牧人，看门的就给他们开门，羊也听他的声音，他按着名叫自己的羊，把羊领出来。
In the same way, a believer in Jesus should follow him and not anyone else, because we know the voice of the Master.
同样的，我们是跟随耶稣，跟随耶稣是耶稣的羊，我们要只听耶稣的声音，不要去跟错别的声音了。
Now, Abraham's time in the Negev in the south of Canaan was soon interrupted by a famine.
在亚伯拉罕那时候要进入迦南地的时候，遇见那个饥荒。
It says, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe.
就是迦南地的时候遭遇饥荒，因饥荒甚大，亚伯兰就下埃及地，要在那边暂居。
Now, I'm sure you remember, especially from the story of Joseph, that there was a 7-year drought cycle at that time.
还记不记得在约瑟时期有7年的干旱？
Well, actually, it's the same today.
其实到今日情况还是一样。
You know, sometimes there's very little water. 1986, it was one of the very dangerous years, very low water.
在1986年的时候，也曾经有过这样的那个水荒，或者是水的那个水位非常的低。
Another low drought year was in 2003.
然后在2003年也曾经遇到那个整个水位非常的低，
So it happens still even today like that.
甚至到今日仍然会出现这种。
Now, according to the chronology of the Bible, this puts Abraham in Egypt during what we call Egypt's first intermediate period.
照着整个历史来看，这一段时间我们称它为第一中期，就是埃及的第一中期时期。
This is
中
when
间时期。
this is when the old kingdom of Egypt, as we call it, was starting to decline.
就是那个我们称为是那个最老的那个埃及王开始要那个下坠，
The
下
famous,
脱了。
the famous pyramids at Giza, which you see in pictures all the time.
在 埃及，我们常常看到的就是这个金字塔的这个画片。
They were already 400 years old.
这已经400年之久。
So this was a time of internal disorder in which local rulers had divided up the land.
在那个地的内里开始不断有那些分裂，开始有一些那个不好了。
It was quite common for Semites, which is the kind of people that Abraham was, to come to, yes, Semitic people, right?
闪族，就是这个就是那个闪族进入到埃及，就是亚伯拉罕那时候的族群进入了。
It was quite common for them to come to Egypt for food when there was a time of drought.
当这样干旱期对他们来讲，进到埃及去寻找食物是非常平常的事。
We have an Egyptian writing from this same period of time that gives details about some of these foreigners coming into the land looking for food.
有一些埃及的那些历史作家有记录下来说，从有一些外国人进到埃及来找食物。
This is when Abraham instructed his wife to say that she was his sister.
这个就是亚伯拉罕在进到那边跟人家讲说他的太太是他的妹妹的时候，
Because he was afraid the Egyptians would kill him and take her.
因为他害怕埃及人会杀了他，要为了他娶他太太而杀了他。
But as we said before, if this was just a lie, why didn't God ever rebuke him for this lie?
若是这是一个说谎的话，为什么神不斥责他这么说谎呢？
But among the Hurrians in the north, calling your wife a sister was a way to honor her.
那在赫人他们的习俗里面，然后称你的太太是姐是妹妹的话，是一个对你太太的尊荣方式。
So later Isaac did the same thing.
所以之后以撒也做了同样的事。
You see, they were just simply being wise within the culture of that day.
所以这是在他们当时的文化里面，他们要有一些智慧，要稍微聪明一点来处理。
But still, this worldly wisdom got Abraham into trouble when Pharaoh took Sarah into his harem.
但是当那个法老王把撒拉要娶为他的太太的时候，也造成了很多的麻烦。
Pharaoh treated Abraham very well because of Sarah.
就是因为撒拉的关系，法老王对待亚伯拉罕非常的好，
Gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and slaves.
给他牛羊群，然后给那些牲畜，还给他仆人。
But then her true identity was revealed by God to Pharaoh.
然后当他的真实的身份被神启示彰显给法老王了，
He struck the royal household with plagues.
他就是用那个瘟疫来袭击整个埃及。
After which Pharaoh sent him away.
然后法老王就赶快把他差派走。
Now this story would have probably gotten a good laugh out of the original audience listening to it because of Abraham's success in being made rich by Pharaoh.
这也许刚开始听见这个故事的人会觉得很好玩，因为这样的关系，那亚伯拉罕突然变得很富有了。
But today a lot of people are concerned about the morality of it. How could Abraham lie?
但是更多人是在乎的是他的道德观，为什么亚伯拉罕说谎呢？
But from the point of view of the story, the Egyptians were wrong, not Abraham, because they came and took Sarah, probably without asking.
在事实上，在整个情况里面，恐怕他们才是受害者，因为埃及人要来夺走撒拉，有可能是根本连问都不问就要把他夺走的。
Abraham was in a life and death situation. He was a refugee.
所以亚伯拉罕就像生死关头的那个难民一样，
He was facing starvation.
他面对的就是这样子的一个生死。
He was very vulnerable in the face of the power of Egypt.
他变得很容易会受伤，因为面对到埃及的这样权势。
So the Bible presents Abraham's action as a wise action.
所以圣经说亚伯拉罕这样子的行为是有智慧的行为，
At a time that his life was at risk.
因为在那时候他的生命是一个冒险。
Well, anyway, from Egypt, Abraham returned first to southern Canaan and then made his way slowly back up to Bethel.
然后他再从埃及回来之后，亚伯拉罕就开始挪到那个迦南的南方，然后逐渐挪移到伯特利，
One of the places he had built an altar.
就是那个他有足坛的地方。
And from his campsite there's a beautiful view going out towards the Jordan Valley.
在那边有一个面对约旦河谷，有个很美的那个视野。
That's a deep rift canyon or valley where the Jordan River runs.
就是在那个约旦河谷有一个整个河谷很美的一个景象。
Now this view is especially clear in the winter time when the winter rains wash all the dust out of the air.
在冬天那个景象非常的清晰，因为冬天有雨，把整个空气都洗得很干净了。
Today when you look down into that valley, it's mostly dry and barren.
今日看见这约旦河谷，大部分是那个荒芜，而且是干旱的。
There's just a few places where it's irrigated with spring water, and so you see a little bit of green.
所以只有少的地方还有一点水，可以看到一些绿草。
There's a little bit of green over here too.
在那边上面有一些绿草。
But if they were not irrigating it, everything would just be dry, barren desert.
若不是因为有少的这些水，要整个山谷就像一个旷野一样了。
But in Abraham's day, the Bible says it was different than this. It was like a garden, the garden of the Lord.
但是在亚伯拉罕时代呢，圣经讲说，这个地方看起来就像一个那个神的园子一样。
Or like the land of Egypt along the Nile River.
就像埃及的尼罗河岸一样。
As it says, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like Eden, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar.
罗德举目看见约旦河的全平原，直到索尔，都是滋润的那地，在耶和华未灭所多玛、俄摩拉以前，如同耶和华的园子，就是伊甸园，也像埃及地。
Well, that's not what we see there today.
这跟我们今日看到的景象不一样哦。
Right? You remember we're down there at the hotel, right?
英达哥还记得你们有去？
It's completely barren.
是完全这个荒芜的。
How could it be so different in the past?
这怎么可能过去是这么不一样呢？
Now the verse there in verse 10, the word in verse 10, well watered in Hebrew is mashaket.
在那个第10节的那个都是那些河水，那些叫希伯来文叫 mashaket。
And this indicates that it was irrigated.
在那时候，
Just
那是有灌溉的，
Just like in the Garden of Eden, just like in the Nile River Valley.
就像那个在尼罗河那个平原，还像伊甸园都有水在灌溉。
Rain flowing down through the dry river valleys or coming up from springs was trapped and then put out in irrigation to water the crops.
所以是和那水从那个山谷这样子聚集，一直流下来，然后穿过那个地，然后从某些地方就会都冒水出来。
As they still do in Jericho today.
就像今日耶利哥仍然是这样。
But this was happening on a much larger scale in Abraham's time.
但是在亚伯拉罕时代，这样的那个范围还更大。
The archaeological evidence for this is 5 large flourishing cities down in this valley at the end of the early Bronze Age.
考古学家，对不起，刚刚没听清楚 ，Can you repeat again?
Yeah, the evidence that it really was this way from outside the Bible is that we found 5 very large cities down in this, what today is a very barren land. How could those big cities be there?
今日的考古学家在那个我们看见很干旱荒芜的那个山谷里面，出土了5个城市，所以无法想象在那时候竟然是跟现在的情况完全不一样。
And the discoveries of these cities are what is known as the Bob and Draw excavations.
那这个Bob and Draw，那个发现那个城市就是这个怎么翻啊？
这是一个地，
就是一个地，
古代的城。
这个 Bob and Draw 这个地方。
These were large and prosperous cities.
这是一个很大的、很昌盛的一个城市。
Now, to give you an idea of the size of these cities, the first burial ground discovered held 500,000 burials.
Burial 是
埋葬的那些。
埋葬哦，这个整个城市有多大？他们在那边有发现各种50万的那个墓地埋葬。
That's one of the largest cemeteries that has been found in the whole ancient Middle East.
在整个中东，发现最大的一个墓园就是这一个了，埋葬了50万的。
And after that, they found 2 other huge cemeteries with almost equal numbers to that.
然后在后来又发现了另外 外2个墓园跟这个大小差不多。
There were a lot of people living down here in Abraham's day.
所以在亚伯拉罕的时代，那个地方是住了很多人口的。
These 5 cities were located, each one at the base of a wadi, that is a dry riverbed canyon.
这是 canyon，
一干的河，
和在那时候有那个干的河谷是这样子的，一直顺着一直下来的。
So you see the canyon comes down here and there's a city.
就是那个河谷一直下来，一直。
Canyon comes down here as a city. Canyon comes down here as a city. Canyon city. Canyon city.
你看那些河谷都是流向这个城市的方向哦，那些现在干的河谷，但是都可以看见那些河谷。
So they were obviously trapping the water from those canyons and using it to irrigate the valley.
所以就可以想象，当初就是这些河谷把水都流到他们这边来，可以来灌溉他们全地。
And these 5 cities match perfectly the cities of the plain mentioned in the Bible.
这5个城市跟圣经里面所描述的完全吻合。
Sodom,
所多玛、
Gomorrah,
俄摩拉、
Admah,
亚玛、
Zeboim,
西点、
and Bela.
但比拉。
Now, a lot of scholars don't want to associate these cities with Abraham.
当然，学者们不想要把这些城市发现的城市吻合到亚伯拉罕当时的那5个城市。
Why not?
为什么不想？
Because they don't want to admit that the Bible is true.
因为他们不想要让人家觉得圣经是真的。
And so they prefer to put Abraham several hundred years later than the Bible does.
所以他们宁愿就是把亚伯拉罕放比圣经所谓的时间几百年之后。
But if we go according to the Bible's own dates, Abraham was there at exactly the time when these cities were still in use, or at the very end of their
若是照着
time.
圣经的时间来算出来的时候，亚伯拉罕在那一个地方的时间，就是在那时候很昌盛的时刻。
So actually this is a very important confirmation of the Bible's date for Abraham.
所以这事实上就是在圣经里面，我们可以考古出来的很重要的亚伯拉罕的时代的那些考古出来的。
Now the view over this very fertile valley must have attracted Lot when he and Abraham stood there at Bethel deciding what to do about their flocks.
所以你可以想象这么昌盛肥沃的土地，那么吸引罗德，就是因为当初要分开2批人的时候，那么吸引罗德要去选那个地方的原因。
They had too many animals to continue grazing together.
他们彼此有太多的那些牲畜，就开始彼此有争执，
And it even come to fighting between their herdsmen.
甚至他们开始有那些吵架打架。
So Lot chose to take all that he had down into the valley, and Abraham would stay up in the hills.
所以罗德就挑选了在整个山谷的那边肥沃的山谷那边，亚伯拉罕就带着到山丘上。
So it says Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot pulled up stakes eastward. They separated.
这边创世纪13章就记载，于是罗德选择约旦河的全平原，往东移去，他们就彼此分离了。
But as you probably already know, Lot's decision was a bad one.
那事实上，我们后人知道，罗德选择的是很糟糕的一个地方。
His life in the Jordan Valley led from one problem to another problem.
他在整个约旦河平原所居住的情况是一个问题接着一个问题而来。
The first problem was an attack of kings coming from the north, from Mesopotamia.
从第一个遇到问题，就是从北方来美索不达米亚的那些王要来攻击他。
They came down against Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities located down in this area.
他们来攻击，就是在这一区域的这些王，就所多玛王、俄摩拉王，北方的4王下来攻击这5王。
This is mentioned in Genesis 14.
在创世纪14章有记载，
It says it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar.
他说当暗拉菲做示拿王的时候，
What is Shinar?
示拿是什么？
Sumer, remember?
示拿其实就是事件。
Ariel, king of Elasar.
然后亚略做以拉撒王，
What's that? That's later what we call Assyria.
那就是之后的叙利亚。
Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. That's what we call today Iran.
基大老嘛，做以兰王，就是现在的伊朗。
And Tidal, king of Goyim. That's from eastern Turkey.
那提达做葛印王，葛印就是那个 East Turkey，东土耳其。
Now this tells us that Sodom and Gomorrah must have been pretty important for these kings to ride hundreds of miles through the desert to attack them.
所以看见这些王可以经历几百里的沙漠，要来攻击索多玛这一整个区，可见这个区是很重要的。
They're obviously not going to do that unless they expect to get a lot.
很明显的，他们就是期待可以从他们掳掠很多，要不然他们不会这么做。
Well, they came down that route that we mentioned called the King's Highway.
那他们沿着这一条路下来，称为王道、王之道。
The second major route going through the land of Israel.
这是第二大条路要进入以色列的路。
And this brought them down along the highlands here before they circled around and went down into the valley where the cities were.
所以他们是从那个高地这样子一直往下来，然后再绕进来到那个山谷去。
The first place they attacked, according to the Bible, is called Ashtaroth, Karnaim Ashtaroth, or Ashtaroth Karnaim.
Ashtaroth
亚特律加
亚特律加林，这是第一个攻击。
And this is the area where all those really strange burials suddenly appeared at just this time.
在那时候，也发现，在那边很多埋葬的地方，就是在那个同一个时期。
With big standing stones like we see in Europe.
在那时候也发现了很多，在那时候那个立起来的石头，就像在欧洲发现的那些石头一样。
What are they doing here?
他们在这边做什么呢？
And it's very interesting that the Bible says that the kings, as they came through this area, were encountered by Rephaim, in other words, giants.
那些被描述说下来的这些，就遇到了那些巨人。
Now, why is this interesting?
为什么这是有趣的事呢？
Because whenever we find these kind of structures in Europe, the local people always tell us they were built by giants.
因为在欧洲，只要发现有那个立成这样的石堆、石块、石门的，他们都会讲，在这个是古代时候的巨人盖的。
Isn't it amazing they have the same tradition way over here in the Middle East?
你有没有发现跟中东的这样的那个做法一样呢？
So maybe there's some truth to it.
所以也许这边有一个事实在里面了。
Besides, in the time of Moses, the Bible mentions giants again in this same city of Ashtaroth.
而且在摩西时代也有曾经提到说，巨人进到这个地方来。
This was the capital city of the huge King Og, the king of Bashan.
King of 巴山王二，那时候他的国度的地方。
Remember, it said his bed was 13 feet long.
还记得他说描述他的床是长9肘
6 feet wide.
16尺
13指。
13尺。
Wow, I wish I had a bed that big.
16尺13尺。
That means he was a really big guy.
意思说他真的是一个很高大的人。
He would have had to be at least 12 feet tall.
应该是有12英尺高。
And that would probably mean he was 600 pounds.
意思说应该有600磅重，那种差不多有300公斤。
Now, I know that imagining big people like this is very strange for us today because of the teaching we hear all the time of evolution.
所以常常我们听起来就很奇怪了，因为我们听习惯进化论了。
Evolutionists don't like to talk about big things in the past, bigger than today.
在进化论不喜欢谈过去有的大，比现在的还要大尺寸的东西。
Because it goes against their story. You know, their story has started little and grew big to what we have today. So how could it be bigger in the past than today?
所以他们不喜欢讲，是因为进化论他们都说从小的一直进化到大的，所以古时候有那个比现在还要大的，他们就不肯讲。
But you know, even today, there are quite a few people who grow to be quite tall, 8 to 9 feet.
是到今日仍然是有一些很高大的人，甚至是9尺高。
So of course, you know, if we have these really big people today, they were also around in the past.
所以今日我们也有这么高大的人，可见在古时候也是有这么高大的人过。
How do you like this bone here?
你看那个骨头、那个脚骨根本是很
He would have been
差距
a
很大，
really, really big man.
所以可见那个人是非常高大的。
And you know, even as recently as 100 years ago, it was considered common knowledge that huge humans had existed in the past.
那事实上，也非常共通的看法，就是古时候是有这么大的这么巨人在。
Farmers would regularly dig up big bones, big skulls in their fields, and it would be reported in the newspapers. It would even be reported in academic journals.
甚至在那个农夫在犁田的时候，有挖出土那个很长的那个人骨，然后甚至记载到他们的有被记载下来。
But now, with the acceptance of evolution, you don't hear about that anymore.
但自从接受是那个进化论的学说之后，这些资讯都不再听到了。
Well, anyway, from Ashtaroth, the kings continued down to Ham here.
所以从那王道，然后一直进到这个下面这个地方来。
And here they encountered other Rephaim, other giants.
还另外的利范因人也是另外的巨人。
And when they continued on to Kiriathaim, also again giants.
所以在这个这个地方也是住的巨人。
So this tells us this whole eastern area was filled with very large people at the time.
所以可以告诉我们，在东边这边，在古时候住了很多像这样的巨人。
And in fact, they were still there in the time of Moses.
事实上，在摩西时刻，他们仍然住在那里。
And from there, they continued down and around, and then finally they came to their target.
所以他们就是沿着这样的山丘下来，到下面再往回走，进到他们的目标。
Why did they do this looping action?
为什么他们要这样用回转的方式上来
This was the way all the kings did it in ancient times.
因为在古时候，所有的王都是习惯这么走。
First, you destroy all the small towns around your target, and that way, when you attack the big city, nobody can come to help them.
首先就是先这样的走超越，把周边的这些小的城市、国家全部都摧毁掉之后，再进到你的目标，以至于你的目标没有其他国可以来帮忙他们了。
So once they got there, they faced the armies of the local kings.
所以，首先他们遇到的那地方面对到就是当地的王，
Who confronted each other in the valley of the Salt Sea.
他们就在那沿海的那个河谷那边就跟他们相遇了。
Now, at the time, this valley was full of tar pits.
在那个地方的时候，当地充满了很多那种沥青，那个我们叫做沥青坑。
We don't see the pits anymore, but the tar is still there.
我们不再看见这些沥青了，但是那些坑都还在那儿。
And this is what creates the famous Black Sea mud.
这就是为什么当地出来的都是黑色的土。
Did you put some on over there?
你去那边的时候，还那边抹一些黑土。
Well, this tar was very valuable in ancient times.
在古时候，这些那个沥青是很重要的。
It was brought to Egypt for different purposes.
它给埃及带来很多不同的目的使用。
It was even used in the making of boats.
甚至也用在造船。
Why don't we see these tar pits anymore today?
为什么今日不再看见这些沥青了呢？
Well, it seems that in Bible days, the Dead Sea did not go all the way south as it has done recently.
因为那时候不像死海，不像我们现在看的，一直延伸到那边东边那边。
It seems the water only went to here. This is the deepest part of the Dead Sea.
就是死海最深的地方，只到这个地方而已，这边没有。
And so this would have been an open valley at the time.
所以在那时候，那个比较靠东边这边都是整个敞开的山谷。
And maybe that's where the tar pits were located.
这是也许就是那些沥青坑，就是都在这个区域里面。
But in Abraham's day, those tar pits could still be seen.
但是在亚伯拉罕时代，这些沥青坑都还看得见。
Now I know that some translations, I think the Chinese says that the enemy fell into the pits, right?
Yeah.
But actually a better translation is simply that they fell as in they were defeated there.
They were defeated there.
That's a better translation.
OK， 翻译那个和合本翻译说那些逃跑的掉在坑里面，那不是，而是说他们那个逃跑都是在这些地方被打败的。正常的翻译是说在这个地方被打败，而不是说掉到坑里面。
The kings from the north took everything from the cities,
北方的王把这城市所有的东西都抢走了，
including people for slaves.
包括把人抢去要当奴隶。
And of course, that included Lot.
当然，这里面包含罗德。
He also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom.
又把亚伯兰的侄儿罗德和罗德的财物掳掠去了。当时罗德正在所多玛。
Another bad decision on Lot's part.
你看见在罗德的决定里面，这又是另外一个很糟糕的决定了。
Well, what happened?
那会发生什么事呢？
Abraham went to the rescue.
亚伯拉罕去把他拯救回来了。
And that's what we're going to talk about next time.
下一次我们就是要从从这边开始讲。
Amen?
阿妹，
Amen. Any questions?
有没有任何疑问要问的？